She has the nerve to show up? Couldn't keep a husband? Couldn't raise a decent son? What is she doing here? The voice didn't come from a corner or a whisper. It came from the third pew, right side. Loud. Proud. So that everyone in the chapel turned to look. It was Aunt Loretta, still draped in a mink collar despite the Florida heat, lips painted red like a warning sign. She didn't even lower her voice. I hadn't even made it past the second row of seats yet. In my hands was a bouquet. Not store-bought, just something I'd picked from my garden that morning. White lilies, a few sprigs of rosemary, the kind of flowers you bring when you remember not just the person, but their quieter moments. Tom used to clip rosemary from that garden, said it helped him think, but no one here wanted my memories. As I stood in the chapel, the murmurs spread like smoke. She came alone? She always does. Well, you reap what you sow. And just like that, I became a cautionary tale at my ex-husband's funeral. I didn't cry. I didn't defend myself. I just looked straight ahead, heels clicking softly on the stone floor as I walked to the back row, the only place left untouched. The place meant for the people no one expects. I didn't expect a welcome, but the cruelty still stung. They acted like I hadn't once stayed up with Tom during his night terrors, like I hadn't sold my wedding band to keep the lights on when David was still in diapers, like I hadn't once been the reason Tom even survived his 30s. But history fades fast when people have a narrative they prefer. I sat down near the exit, beneath the dim glow of an old exit sign buzzing like a warning. The smell of lilies, mixed with furniture polish and self-righteousness, filled the room. It clung to my clothes, my throat. Every breath felt like swallowing dust. From where I sat, I could just make out David, my son, 3 rows from the front. His posture was stiff, hands folded, suit sharp. He looked alone. But he didn't turn around. Not when I entered. Not when they whispered. Not even when Aunt Loretta snorted and muttered something else that made the whole row chuckle like it was bingo night. They thought he'd turned on me. They assumed because he sat beside Tom's sisters that he'd chosen their side, that I was the forgotten woman. The ex-wife nobody claimed. The faded chapter in a story they were rewriting without me. But they didn't know David. They didn't know the things he carried quietly, like I once did. The organ started, a low, dragging hum. People stood. I stayed seated. Tom's casket came down the aisle. Mahogany, heavy, more elaborate than he would have wanted. But I didn't look at the box. I looked at his hands, folded, still. Once, those hands had built me a bookshelf from scraps. It wobbled, but I loved it. Now, they lay useless. Too late for fixing things. The minister spoke words about redemption, about memory, about legacy. None of them mentioned me. None dared. When it was over, people started shifting. Purses zipped, programs folded, a few hugged, some left. And then, a new voice. Not the preacher, not the organist. It came from the front of the room, calm, firm, unmistakably legal. Before we conclude today's service, there is one final matter to address. The voice belonged to a man in a gray suit, tall, composed, briefcase in hand. As per the personal instructions of Mr. Thomas Whitaker, we are to acknowledge the presence of Margaret Whitaker for the reading of a private estate directive. There was a pause, then a sound, not words, just a sharp intake of breath from at least 3 relatives. All heads turned. Margaret, me. I didn't move, not yet. And for the first time since I stepped into that chapel, no one spoke, no one dared. Not even Loretta, not even the ones who'd laughed. Because suddenly, I wasn't the ghost in the back row anymore. I was the storm they didn't see coming. There was a time Margaret thought love was enough. She married Tom when they had nothing but youth and a second-hand sofa. They used to laugh about how the springs poked their backs, but even that sofa felt like luxury compared to what came later. The early years were tender, if hard. Tom worked construction, and Margaret took shifts at the diner, wiping down counters past midnight. They had David after 5 years of scraping together just enough for a crib and a used car. The night he was born, Tom cried, really cried, and swore he'd build something better for them all. But then the accident happened. It wasn't anything dramatic, just one bad fall from scaffolding, just enough to keep Tom home for months, icing his back, gritting his teeth. And when the job never called again, something in him broke that no doctor could set right. He tried for a while, applied to a few places, fixed the faucet, walked David to school, but the longer he stayed home, the quieter he got. Until one morning, Margaret came back from a shift and found the bedroom closet half empty, no note. Just his watch on the nightstand and David's favorite bedtime book left open on the couch. She waited for days, weeks, but Tom didn't come back. No one really said it out loud, but people looked at her differently after that. Like maybe she'd pushed him away, like maybe the weight of his silence had come from something she did. And in a town like theirs, small and close and full of whispers, that kind of stain was hard to wash off. Still, Margaret didn't crumble. She put on her uniform. She cleaned other people's homes, while her own sat half dark. She sold the necklace Tom had given her on their first anniversary to keep the power on through winter. And when David asked where Daddy went, she lied as gently as she could. "Just working far, honey. He'll write." But Tom didn't write, not for months. Margaret learned how to patch the roof by watching YouTube on a cracked tablet. She fixed the boiler with a borrowed wrench. On nights she couldn't sleep, she stitched name tags into David's school shirts and folded them with shaking hands. There were days she went without dinner so he could have lunch money. Nights she sat by the window just in case headlights pulled into the driveway. But they never did. And yet, for all that, she never poisoned David against his father. Not once. Even when he came home with questions she knew were fed by someone else. "Why did Dad leave?" "Uncle Mike says maybe you didn't make him happy anymore." "Aunt Lynn says good wives don't push their husbands away." Each word left a bruise, but Margaret smiled through it. She said, "People say all kinds of things when they don't know the whole story." She said, "Your dad loved you, he just got lost." She said, "You don't need to pick sides, sweetheart. You're made of both of us." But inside it burned, quietly, constantly. Still, she kept showing up, school recitals, doctor visits, birthdays with paper hats and homemade cakes. Every milestone, she made sure David never missed the feeling of being wanted. When he broke his wrist at 12, she took the day off and sat beside him the whole night at the ER. When he failed math once, she stayed up tutoring him with an old workbook from the library. When his voice cracked during puberty, she was the one who helped him tie his first real tie for a school dance. He once looked at her in the mirror that night and said, "You're the strongest person I know, Mom." And she had to turn away before he saw her cry. For a few years, she believed that was enough. That maybe, just maybe, love would circle back. But as David grew older, the whispers grew louder. Tom hadn't disappeared completely. He'd moved 3 towns over, started doing odd jobs, maybe construction again. He never remarried, never reached out. But the family on his side, they had plenty to say. "They say he sends money," David told her once. "That you just never told me." Margaret blinked. "Did he say that?" David shook his head. "Uncle Mike did." And just like that, Margaret saw it, how doubt creeps in like water through a crack. Not from malice, but from repetition. From silence. She didn't argue. She never did. She just smiled and said, "What matters is you know who you are." But at night, when David was asleep, she'd sit at the table and reread every receipt she kept, every invoice she paid, every note she didn't get from Tom. She wasn't looking for proof, just reassurance that she hadn't imagined it all. One day, a letter came. It was from a bank. Inside was a statement for a savings account she didn't know existed. The name on it was hers, but the deposits had all been made by Tom. Small ones, over years, quiet, steady, careful. She said nothing to David. Another time, a package arrived. No return address. Inside was a stack of drawings David had made as a child, ones that had gone missing years ago. At the bottom, in Tom's handwriting, "I kept them safe." That night, Margaret opened the cedar chest at the end of her bed and placed the drawings inside. Then she took a deep breath, laid her hand on the worn wood, and whispered, "I see you trying. It's late, but I see it." Even then, she didn't tell anyone, because Margaret wasn't someone who clung to the past. She was someone who waited for the moment her truth would speak for itself. And one day, it would. Just not yet. It started with little things, an invitation that never arrived, a family photo posted online where she had clearly been cropped out. Margaret didn't ask. She just stared at the edges of that photo on her phone, eyes watering not from rage, but from that familiar ache of being forgotten. The first Sunday she wasn't invited to Sunday dinner. She assumed it was a miscommunication. The second time, she made a pot roast anyway, just in case. The third, she stopped checking the time. She still dropped off small gifts for Lily, her granddaughter, a scarf she knitted, a box of watercolor pencils, a book they used to read together, but they never showed up in the little girl's room again. One day, she left a birthday present on the front porch and heard the door lock click shut from the other side. No hello, no thank you. Just that click. She walked back to the bus stop with the gift still in hand. That night, she didn't sleep, not even close. Weeks later, she received a text from her niece, a group invite to the family's annual memorial gathering. It wasn't sent directly, just forwarded, as if someone remembered her name at the last minute. Still, she went. It was held at the eldest uncle's house, where generations of family stories had once echoed through loud laughter and clinking glasses. But this time, Margaret didn't bring anything but her hands folded neatly in front of her. No one assigned her a dish. No one said a word when she arrived. She found a small folding chair in the kitchen. Everyone else was gathered in the backyard, bright, loud, warm. Someone had brought a speaker. Kids were running barefoot in the grass. Margaret sat alone, a paper plate in her lap, staring down at a spoonful of mashed potatoes and a slice of ham that tasted like nothing. The screen door behind her creaked open. She heard voices, low and sharp. "I swear if I were her, I'd have found a bridge years ago." Laughter. "I don't know how she keeps showing up, like a ghost who doesn't get it." Another voice, female, maybe a cousin or a wife of someone. "They say she used to be beautiful. What happened to her?" Margaret didn't move. She didn't cry. She just sat there, breathing through her nose, hands tight around her plastic fork like it might hold her together. After a while, she put the plate down and quietly left without a word. That evening, it rained. Not a storm, just a slow, steady drizzle that made the porch steps slick and the kitchen window foggy. Margaret kicked off her shoes by the door and went straight to her room. She didn't turn on the light. She sat on the edge of her bed in the dark. And for the first time in 30 years, she let herself sob. Not the kind of crying that came with sniffles or apologies. This was deeper, raw, guttural. Her shoulders shook. Her hands clawed at the blanket. She folded into herself like a piece of paper someone forgot to write on. She cried for the years, for the nights she stayed awake sewing costumes for school plays, for the shifts she picked up when Tom disappeared, for every dinner eaten alone, every voicemail left unanswered, every family photo where she was erased like a mistake. She wept for the version of herself that once dreamed of writing books, or learning French, or simply being asked how her day went. When her body could no longer sob, she simply lay still. The house was silent. Then, a thought nudged her. The box. It was buried in the back of her closet, wrapped in a faded scarf that once belonged to Tom. She hadn't opened it since the day it was handed to her by a hospice nurse with trembling hands and kind eyes. He said, "To give this to you when you're ready." She hadn't been ready, until now. Margaret reached in and lifted the lid slowly, like she was afraid it might burn her. Inside, everything was exactly as it had been. A stack of old letters, some brittle at the edges, a bundle of photos, her, David, and Tom, before everything splintered. And beneath it all, an envelope marked in Tom's handwriting. For Margaret, only you. Her fingers traced the letters, then she opened it. Inside was a handwritten letter, tear-stained and smudged in places. Tom's words spilled across the page like he was still trying to explain himself after all these years. He had failed her, he admitted. Not because he stopped loving her, but because he couldn't love himself. I left, he wrote, because I didn't know how to stay. I thought I'd ruined everything. I thought I'd let you down so badly that you'd be better off without me. And then, tucked inside the same envelope, 2 documents. One was a savings account statement, still active, still in her name, over $80,000. The other, a will, dated a year ago, signed and notarized. He had rewritten his will, leaving everything to her. Because it was always yours, he scribbled at the end. I just had to find the courage to give it back. Margaret held the pages to her chest. Her tears returned, but softer now. Not the kind that broke you, the kind that reminds you you are still whole, even then, even now. And in the stillness of that rainy evening, something inside her shifted. Not anger, not revenge, just clarity. She stood, wiped her face, and reached for the phone. It was time to make a call, not to ask for permission, but to remind the world, quietly, firmly, who she had always been. It began with silence. Not the soft kind, but the thick, waiting kind. The kind that settles before something unthinkable is about to unfold. The church hall had started to empty out after the funeral, but a small crowd lingered near the front, not because of grief, but curiosity. Margaret could feel their eyes still on her as she quietly picked up her purse and stood. She hadn't expected much. She'd brought flowers, paid her respects. She was ready to walk away, again, with dignity. But then the lawyer stepped forward. He wasn't loud, just clear, calm, unshaken. "If I may have your attention," he said, lifting a manila folder from his briefcase. Mr. Thomas Whitaker, before his passing, requested that his final wishes be shared publicly today. Chairs scraped. Whispering started again. Someone near the front muttered, "Now what? He had nothing left anyway." But the lawyer wasn't concerned with their murmurs. He pulled a folded sheet from the folder, then glanced toward the back. First, as stipulated in the will, all personal savings, the Lakeview house, and the remaining pension benefits are to be transferred to... He paused, not for drama, just to read carefully. Margaret Whitaker. The air changed. It was like someone had cracked glass down the center of the room. A stunned beat of silence followed, then a loud, harsh scoff from Tom's sister. "Her? You've got to be joking." Margaret stayed still, her hands in her lap. The lawyer continued. Additionally, the safe deposit box at Weststone Bank contains documents and items that were explicitly reserved for Mrs. Whitaker and their son David. It wasn't the money, it was the recognition. The people who'd spent years painting her as disposable, as the ex-wife left behind, were now shifting in their seats, uncertain, trying to do the math in their heads. She could hear Tom's older brother hiss under his breath. "There's no way Tom meant that. He was probably tricked." And then a voice rose from the first row. It was David. Until now, he hadn't said a word. He'd sat quietly next to his wife, his daughter Lily tucked between them. But now he stood. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "I was with Dad when he signed it." People turned. His wife's jaw tightened. His aunt visibly flinched. He was sick, but he wasn't confused. "He asked me to bring the papers. He asked me to witness it." Margaret felt something warm and tight build in her throat. But she didn't cry. She couldn't. Not yet. He wanted to make sure the woman who saved him, even after everything, got what she deserved. David turned then. His eyes swept across the rows of stiff, uncomfortable relatives. "None of you showed up when Dad lost everything, when he couldn't work, when he hated himself. You left him in that cheap apartment and only called when you needed favors. But she..." He nodded to his mother. "She didn't walk away. She just waited, quietly, with grace none of you deserve to even speak of." A soft gasp came from somewhere in the back. One of the cousins stood and left, red-faced. Still, Margaret sat. Still, she hadn't moved. But Lily, sweet Lily, slipped out from her chair and padded over, holding a small piece of paper clutched in her fingers. It was a drawing. A house with stick figures, a woman in purple, a boy, and a little girl. A big red heart over their heads. "I made this for you, Grandma," Lily whispered. "But Mommy said not to give it. I saved it in my jacket." The room didn't go quiet. It went numb. Margaret bent forward, gently took the drawing, and touched Lily's cheek. It was the first human contact she'd had from that family in years. No one laughed now. David's words still lingered in the air, like the final chime of a clock after midnight. Undeniable. Irreversible. Margaret held the child's drawing in her hand, soft paper worn from being folded so many times. She smoothed it gently with her thumb, not speaking. There was nothing to say. The room had already spoken for her, for years. With its silence, with its sneers, with its polite dismissals and birthday invitations that somehow never made it to her mailbox. The lawyer, ever composed, returned to the front. "There is more," he said, "if you'll indulge me." No one dared stop him now. He retrieved a second envelope, this one sealed in wax with the initials TW embossed on the back. It was slightly thicker, slightly heavier, not just in weight, but in meaning. He broke the seal. "This is a letter," he explained, "written by Mr. Whitaker several months before his death. He requested it be read aloud only if there were disputes." Someone near the front huffed. Of course he did, but the lawyer had already begun. "To my family, if you are hearing this, then I've gone, and so have all my excuses. I lived my life haunted by two things, my pride and my silence. Margaret, you were my harbor when everything else collapsed, and I let that go. I chose shame over humility. I let my own failures define me, and in doing so, I left the only people who ever loved me for who I really was. I did not remarry. Not because I couldn't, but because I knew. I had already met the person I was supposed to grow old with. I just wasn't man enough to grow up in time. This will likely anger some of you. You'll wonder why the money went to her, why I didn't split it, why I didn't reward loyalty. But loyalty is not just presence, it's sacrifice. It's who brings soup when you're sick and holds your pride when you're too broken to carry it. Margaret did that, not once, not twice, but for decades, without applause. David, my boy, if you're listening, I pray you forgive me for the years I wasn't beside you, but I see the man you've become. And I know, in that, your mother gave you everything I could not. Take care of her, and please don't let them shame her for loving me longer than I deserved. Tom. By the end, not a single chair creaked. Some lowered their heads, others blinked hard, pretending they weren't. Margaret? She closed her eyes. Not because she was overwhelmed, not exactly, but because something inside her was finally quiet, like a door that had been banging in the wind for years had finally shut. And in that silence, she breathed. When she opened her eyes again, she met David's gaze, and found her son standing taller than she'd ever seen him. Not proud of the inheritance, proud of truth, of memory, of her. Aunt Joanne, who had once scoffed, now looked at the floor. The cousin who had whispered behind Margaret's back leaned against the wall, arms folded tightly, face pale. No one said another cruel word. Not because they were suddenly kind, but because now the story had changed, and for once they weren't the authors. The lawyer cleared his throat, then gestured toward the small table near the pulpit. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said, soft and firm, "if you'd like, everything is ready for you to sign. The transfer forms, access details, all of it." Margaret didn't rush. She stood with care, smoothed her coat, and walked slowly past every pair of eyes that had once watched her from above. Now they watched her rise. She signed the papers without flourish. No smile, no smirk, just steadiness. And when she was done, she turned, not to gloat, but to leave. But before she reached the exit, someone called her name. It was her daughter-in-law. "Margaret, wait!" Her voice cracked mid-sentence. Margaret paused, not out of obedience. "But Grace, I didn't know. About the letter. About any of it. I know, Margaret said simply. There was no accusation in her voice, just truth. Heavy, honest truth. Then she looked down at Lily, who was gripping her hand like a vine clings to light. You coming with me, sweetheart? The little girl nodded instantly, and as Margaret walked through the chapel doors, hand in hand with her granddaughter, the sunlight hit her face. For the first time in years, it didn't sting. It warmed, and behind her no one laughed anymore. The silence after the lawyer said my name didn't just hover, it thundered. It cracked through the smug expressions, wiped the smirks off Linda's face, and even made my son's voice catch in his throat. I didn't speak. I didn't have to. Mr. Holden, our late family attorney and one of the few people who'd seen me through both love and betrayal, cleared his throat and, with a tone more measured than I'd ever heard from him, began reading. Per Thomas Bennett's revised and final will, dated March 4th of this year, March, just 5 months before the funeral. His estate, including the house on Everpine Road, all investment portfolios, and his pension rollover account, is to be transferred in full ownership to Margaret Bennett, his former wife. I heard a gasp, then another, then a chair leg scraped against the floor. But that's not even legal. Linda's voice cut through the room, sharp and breaking. They were divorced. He couldn't leave everything to her. She's not family anymore. Mr. Holden adjusted his glasses slowly. He could. He did. The law permits it as long as the will is valid and witnessed. He paused. And it was. I was one of those witnesses. Linda stood up, fists clenched. This is absurd. You're all just trying to cut us out. David stood too, voice firmer now, eyes not on her but on me. You cut her out, Aunt Linda, years ago, when you treated her like a ghost. And now you're surprised she didn't include you in a story that was never yours? I had never heard him speak like that, and yet he wasn't done. He turned to the crowd, who had suddenly shrunk in their chairs, quiet as mice at a storm's edge. Dad knew what he did, and he knew what she endured. He spent the last years trying to make it right. Not for us, for her. For a moment I wanted to break. I wanted to crumble into tears, but not here, not now. Linda's husband, Greg, leaned forward. Well, surely the rest... There is no rest, Mr. Holden interrupted. Mr. Bennett's revised instructions also include the removal of access rights to the Everpine residence for all individuals, besides Mrs. Bennett and David Bennett. That includes the key cards. They've been deactivated. Linda's face drained of color. What? Oh, and Holden flipped to another page, as if this was just routine. In a handwritten note, legal and included in the will, he asked for a very specific request, that the family acknowledge, in writing, their understanding of why he made this change before they pursue any legal challenge. What kind of, his words, not mine, because they laughed at the woman who carried me, buried my shame, and held my son when I was too weak to love him, and I won't die with that laughter still echoing in my house. Now it was silent again. Only this time, it wasn't shocked silence. It was the kind of silence that knows it can't argue. The kind of silence you sit in when you're realizing you're no longer the main character in a story you thought belonged to you. Linda didn't sit back down. She just stood there, blinking like she didn't recognize the room anymore. Her husband Greg opened his mouth, maybe to protest, maybe to ask a question, but nothing came out. Not even he could spin it now. Across the room, some of the other family members began inching away. The same ones who'd whispered and smirked when I entered earlier, who'd taken photos near Tom's casket like it was some red carpet event. They weren't laughing anymore. In fact, most of them couldn't meet my eyes. David took a deep breath beside me, then turned to Mr. Holden. Was that everything, sir? Holden nodded slowly, then added, Oh, there's one more thing. The room collectively held its breath. Tom instructed that a certain letter, written in his own hand, be read aloud only if the will's terms were challenged in any way. Since they were... His eyes flicked briefly toward Linda, who still looked like someone had yanked the earth from beneath her feet. He unfolded the sealed paper gently. His voice softened, and somehow that made the words hit harder. To the people who sat and judged a woman they never understood, Margaret was my wife long after the divorce papers were signed, not in the legal sense, but in every way that mattered. She was the mother to my child when I couldn't be a father. She held her dignity when I handed her shame. And when I fell apart, she didn't gloat. She didn't curse. She just turned away quietly like a candle closing its flame. I came to her in my last months, not with a promise, but with a prayer. That she'd forgive me. And she did. In her way. To those who mocked her, ridiculed her, cut her out of photos, birthday dinners, and your own hearts, I hope this moment teaches you something. If it doesn't, then you deserve to feel small, because she never needed any of this. She only ever needed one thing, for someone to tell the truth. And now I have. Tom. Holden folded the letter back with reverence, then silence again. The kind of silence that tastes like stone. Linda collapsed back into her chair like a puppet whose strings had finally been cut. Someone behind her whispered something about reconsidering plans. Another mumbled, "I didn't know it was that bad." But none of it mattered now. Because it was done. Afterward, people began to shuffle out slowly. Some offered weak nods in my direction. One even tried to say sorry, but the words slipped from his tongue like they burned. I just looked at him, not with anger, but with a calm he didn't understand. Maybe never would. When only a few remained, David helped me to my feet. His hand lingered on my shoulder like it meant to anchor me in this new reality. "You okay, Mom?" I nodded, though I wasn't sure what okay even meant anymore. But this wasn't about being okay. It was about being seen. And finally, after years of silence, shame, and empty chairs at birthday tables, I had been seen. We walked outside together, just the two of us. The air was cooler than I remembered, or maybe it was just the first time in years I'd felt it on my skin without weight. As we stepped out into the light, David turned to me and said the words I had waited over half my life to hear. "Let's go home." The air smelled different that morning. Not of incense or grief, but of warm bread, fresh dew, and lavender soap. I opened my kitchen window wide. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I had to whisper in my own home. The silence was no longer suffocating. It had been weeks since the funeral, since the lawyer's voice sliced through the laughter and judgment and reminded them all that I still mattered, that I had always mattered. I didn't return to that house, not even to collect what little of mine they hadn't boxed up without asking. I walked out with just my purse, my dignity, and my son's hand in mine. That was more than enough. Now I live in a small, sun-drenched apartment on the edge of town. Nothing grand. Just enough space for a table by the window, a bed I can stretch across, and shelves lined with books I never had time to read when I was too busy bending myself into everyone else's needs. Most mornings, I volunteer at the library. I read aloud to children. Some of them remind me of David when he was little. Quiet eyes, big questions, always leaning a bit closer when I change my voice for a dragon or a knight. One girl, Ruby, asked me last week, "Why do you always smile so much, Miss Margaret?" I told her the truth. Because I've finally remembered who I am. It didn't happen overnight. The pain didn't leave just because I stood tall once. But it lessened each time I chose peace over pleasing. Each time I said no without guilt. And each time I didn't check my phone waiting for an apology that never came. To the ones watching this now, especially the women sitting alone in the kitchen at night, wondering if they've become invisible. You're not. You are not what they say when they think you're not listening. You are not the leftover chair at the table. You are not too sensitive, too much, or too expensive to care for. You are a whole story, a full voice. And if no one's told you lately, you deserve more than scraps of affection served cold. Some evenings, I sit on the porch with a cup of tea and watch the sky turn gold. There's no one shouting from another room, no doors slamming, no accusations, just the wind, the birds, and silence, the kind that heals instead of hurts. David visits often, not out of duty, but because he wants to. Sometimes he brings his son, my grandson, who always runs into my arms like it's the safest place on earth. And in those moments, I no longer feel like a discarded name on a guest list or a faded memory in someone else's story. I feel seen, I feel loved. And for those of you listening, maybe you've been there too. Maybe you've sat at a family table and wondered when you stopped being family. Maybe you've sacrificed until your hands were raw, your heart wrung out, and still, someone looked you in the eye and told you it wasn't enough. But let me tell you something no one told me until now. You were never the problem. You were the spine. The one holding everything up while others leaned without ever thanking you. You were never invisible, just unrecognized by those who chose not to see. So if you're watching this with a lump in your throat or tears in your eyes, I want you to know, you're not alone, and you're not done. There's a life beyond betrayal. There's joy after grief. There's dignity in walking away from the table that laughed at your hunger. If this story felt like yours, I invite you to share it in the comments. You never know who needs to hear that they're not the only one. And if someone you love needs this message, send it to them. And if you've stayed until now, thank you. I hope my voice felt like a friend beside you. Subscribe if you'd like to hear more stories like this. But even if you don't, walk tall. You are enough. Always were, always will be.